My name is Serafina. I'm 32 years old, and I spend most of my life in front of a screen at a major tech company, writing code and getting paid handsomely for it. So handsomely, in fact, that by the standards of my peers, I'm the one who earns more than most. While on the surface this might seem like a reason for gratitude, deep down I often wonder if this prosperity makes me a target for other people's worries and needs. I have a family, a mother and father, both in their 70s, who retired 5 years ago. My father works in construction, my mother a former secretary at a law firm. They have pensions, but they're not what they used to be, and so financial holes are appearing more and more often. My older sister Rita is 36 years old. She's married to Michelangelo. They have 2 children, 15-year-old Pietro and 13-year-old Elma. Our family is almost always short of something. So when the bills pile up, the looks and requests invariably turn to me. It all started modestly when I got a job 6 years ago and heard a familiar request on the phone. "Sir, we're tight this month. Could you help with the electricity?" And I said, sure, because these were my parents. They raised me, fed me, and provided a roof over my head, and helping seemed natural then. But then they demanded more and more. First groceries, then prescriptions for my father, then car insurance, and then Rita got involved. Michelangelo's truck needs tires. Pietro wants to take a programming course. It costs $800. Always something urgent. Always a reason to turn to me. And the most bitter thing is the feeling that the road to help only goes one way. Because when I myself needed support, it suddenly turned out that everyone had their own problems, that everyone was busy with something. And I felt this especially acutely 8 months ago, when, having finally bought an apartment after a long time of saving, I discovered that there were many more things than I could carry alone, and I turned to Rita. Maybe Michelangelo will help. A couple of hours, load the truck, then unload it? I thought it was natural, but 2 days before the move, Rita called back and said without further explanation, "Serafina, about Saturday. Michelangelo won't be able to help you move." I asked what was wrong and was told he was fine, but they talked and decided they had their own family and their own worries, and that I would have to figure it out myself. Then she hung up and I had to hire movers for $400, which I hadn't planned on, but I didn't make a scene or blame them. I simply did as they said, and I remember that conversation, cold, short, and memorable. But I continued to do what I always did, help, because they were always busy. Either Mom needed to send money for groceries early, or Dad's prescription drug bills were mounting, or Rita's car was breaking down again, or Pietro needed new soccer cleats, or Elma needed a laptop for school, and it all fell on me as if by law. At the end of October, I got tired of waiting for the right moment, and I decided to stop by my parents' house for dinner. I hadn't seen them for several weeks and just wanted to spend the evening at the same table. But when I arrived, Rita, Michelangelo, and the children were already sitting at the table. Mom, as usual, put a thick stew on the table, and everything began as if I hadn't even been there. Mom talked to Rita about Elma's schoolwork and Pietro's soccer matches, asked about Rita's work and plans for the holidays. Everyone discussed the household and the children, and I sat, ate, and waited for someone to ask at least about work or the new apartment. But no one asked, and in the middle of dinner, Dad suddenly coughed, just a little cough. But Mom turned to him and looked at him like that, and he looked back at her as if some kind of idea had arisen between them. Mom put down her fork and turned to me as if she'd deliberately paused time for a moment, a wide but clearly false smile appearing on her face as she said quietly, as if not for me, but for someone else's ears, "Serafina, my dear, we've discussed everything and decided that we really do need a country house where the whole family can relax together." And at that moment, I felt the word us tightening the circle of my personal space more than all my previous requests combined. I blinked because the phrase sounded both like an invitation and a demand at the same time, and asked evenly and calmly, although everything inside me was seething, "A country house? Where exactly do you see that?" Mom, as if she had already prepared her answer, smiled even wider and said that she had already found a place, somewhere outside the city in the fresh air, where she and Dad would be able to breathe easier and take morning walks, where the children could run and play when they came to visit. And I glanced at those around the table. Rita nodded. Michelangelo silently supported her with a nod. Even Pietro and Elma looked at me with naive joy, as if a wonderful fairy tale had been unfolded before them, and I was the only one who was shocked by this proposal. "Mom, now's not the time to buy a country house," I replied, trying not to raise my voice. I reminded them of what had happened 6 months ago, the crack in their house's foundation and the experts' conclusion that it urgently needed reinforcement, which would require significant investment. Mom waved her hand as if swatting away a fly and said, "Oh, that's all nonsense. This crack isn't going anywhere. Your father and I need to think about our quality of life in retirement." Then her tone turned to a direct, spine-tingling plea. "We need a country house, so you buy it, Serafina." I, not understanding why I was being dragged into this game, asked point blank, "What do you need me for?" "You're the only one in the family who can afford it," she said, her voice slightly naked, as if she were passing judgment, and I explained the situation clearly and without rhetoric. "I have a mortgage. I don't have the available funds for a down payment on a second home." But that same twinkle I recognized from previous conversations immediately flashed in her eyes, and she spoke in numbers as if they were trivial matters. "I've already found the perfect place, only $235,000, which means the down payment will be small and the monthly payments will be tiny." And these words hung in the air, as if they said everything was already decided. Then I glanced again at the people sitting there. My father was waiting. Rita crossed her arms and looked at me with that mixture of resentment and demand that I already knew all too well. Michelangelo nodded in agreement, and the children, not understanding the full weight of what was happening, simply waited for my consent. "Mom, I can't buy you a house," I said slowly and gravely. "I have a mortgage to pay." And Mom immediately leaned over, looked me in the face, and whispered a figure as if it were the key to everything. "The monthly payments will only be about $1,500. I replied that my own mortgage was already $2,000, and therefore I had no intention of taking out another loan on a house I would never live in. And this honesty broke the silence in the room. The temperature between us dropped. My mother's face turned pale, and my father said quietly, as if his words were a sentence, "I think now we know who we could have counted on." And in that moment, I felt the gaze of every person present squeezing me in the grip of public censure, because I suddenly found myself the culprit of all their unfulfilled plans. Arguing became pointless, and I quietly said, "I think I should go." And my mother only responded rather dryly, "I think you should too." No one walked me to the door or said goodbye, and I went home feeling like I'd lost my family for asking a question that perhaps shouldn't have been asked. 2 months of absolute silence passed. The phone was silent. There were no usual calls asking for money for groceries, no messages about rising prices for my father's prescription drugs, no panicked emails from Rita about another car breakdown or about Pietro urgently needing football boots. Even Elma didn't ask for a laptop for school, which was strange for someone who had never gone a week without a request before, because Rita usually had at least one crisis a month. Thanksgiving passed me by. I wasn't invited. I ate Chinese food alone and watched movies, and somewhere deep inside, I held the hope that at the last minute the phone would ring and Mom would say they were just messing around, and that, of course, I should come. But the call never came, and as Christmas approached, a fragile hope flared within me again that maybe they'd had time to think. Maybe they realized they were asking too much of me. Christmas had always been a big deal in our family, and I couldn't believe they'd let some silly argument ruin this holiday, which had brought us all together around the table for so many years. And deep down, I convinced myself that this time, too, everything would be just as it always had. I went shopping, browsing the displays, choosing gifts, and trying to make each one special, so that each of their eyes would light up when they saw what I brought. And in the end, the gifts really turned out to be generous and thoughtful. I bought my father a new tablet as his old one was practically falling apart in his hands. I picked out a soft, warm cashmere sweater for my mother, confident she'd love it and that she might even remember how she'd once dreamed of such things herself. For Rita, I found an expensive perfume she'd mentioned more than once in recent months. For Michelangelo, I bought a nice watch so he could wear it every day and feel important. For Pietro, I bought the latest gaming headset so he could finally spend his evenings the way he wanted, and Elma got an elegant jewelry box she'd once mentioned in passing, and I remembered the look in her eyes, full of light, dreamy thought. In total, I spent almost $2,000, much more than usual, but I wanted to show that I still cared about them, that even if I couldn't buy them a house, I wanted to be a part of their lives and their holidays. A week before Christmas, I decided to call my mother, and my heart pounded as I waited for the dial tone. "Hi, Mom, it's Serafina," I said, and her voice answered, calm, neutral, neither cold nor warm, as if she were speaking to a stranger. I plucked up the courage to ask, "Tell me, will we be celebrating Christmas at your house like usual?" There was a pause, and then I heard, "Yes, we are celebrating Christmas." "Yes, Serafina, you're invited. Your family, after all." In that instant, relief washed over me, so powerful that I almost cried with joy. It hadn't been our most affectionate conversation, but the invitation had been made, and in that moment, it seemed as if everything could return to normal. On the eve, December 24th, I loaded the car with the bags, boxes, and duffel bags that held my presents and headed to my parents' house. I spotted Rita's car in the driveway, and my heart sank. That meant everyone was here. When I walked in, I was greeted by the smells of Mom's ham and sweet potatoes. The air was thick and warm from cooking, and Rita, Michelangelo, Pietro, and Elma were already sitting in the living room, all in the familiar bustle of home. I placed the presents under the tree and immediately noticed that my pile of boxes significantly outweighed everything else already there, but I decided to ignore it. We sat down to dinner, and for a while, everything was as if nothing bad had happened between us. Dad asked about my work, Rita talked about Elma's school play, Michelangelo looked genuinely happy to see me, and we laughed as if we'd stepped back in time. No one mentioned the country house, no one cast any sidelong glances, and the dinner was so good that when Mom invited me to spend the night in my old room, I readily accepted. It was wonderfully pleasant to return to the walls where I'd spent my childhood, and it seemed to me that perhaps things really were moving toward reconciliation. Christmas morning greeted me with an excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. We all gathered around the tree in our pajamas, just like when Rita and I were children, and it seemed as if we'd regained that long-lost sense of closeness. Everyone was opening presents, thanking each other, laughing, and I sat looking at them, overwhelmed with joy at having brought them happiness. But gradually, I noticed something strange. All the presents were open, and I wasn't holding a single box. I looked under the tree, looked around, and suddenly realized there was nothing with my name on it. "Where's my Christmas present?" I asked quietly, and instantly the room fell silent, thick and heavy. Everyone froze, looked at each other, and then suddenly they started laughing. Mom spoke first, still chuckling. "Santa Claus doesn't give presents to ungrateful children," and I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "What?" I blurted out. Rita jumped up, smirking. "It's your own fault, Serafina. You refused to help the family when we needed you most, and that's the result." Dad nodded gravely and said, "We raised you, Serafina, gave you everything. And when we asked for help, you turned your back on us. Ungrateful children don't get presents at Christmas." I sat in my pajamas, surrounded by the expensive things I'd bought them, listening to them explain why I didn't deserve even a small card in return. Everything inside me was bursting to burst forth. I wanted to scream, to list every bill I'd paid, every time I'd bailed them out, every time I'd dropped what I was doing and run to them. But looking at their faces, full of condemnation and a kind of ominous certainty, I realized it was useless. that in their eyes I was already a villain, an ungrateful daughter who hadn't bought them a house. "Okay," I said quietly, got up and went to my old room, packing my things while they remained downstairs, no doubt discussing how awful I was. And when I came down with my bag, no one said a word, no one stopped me or said goodbye. On Christmas morning, I left the house and instantly decided I'd had enough. I couldn't live with the feeling that my entire life had been reduced to nothing more than a bottomless purse for those who felt obligated to pay for their mistakes and whims. I was tired of feeling like a doormat thrown at their feet every time something needed wiping or hiding. I firmly decided that from now on, they would solve their own problems, and I would finally allow myself to live for myself. For the first time since starting my job, I didn't send a penny to either of them. My paychecks went into my bank account and stayed there, and I watched, almost in amazement, as my savings grew month after month. The feeling was astonishing, as if I'd discovered a long-forgotten secret of my own power. I'd forgotten how much I actually earned when I didn't give half of it away, and at first, this simple thought even terrified me. I increased my mortgage payments. Instead of the usual $2,000, I now made $3,000, which meant my apartment would be paid off in 10 years instead of 30. The thought of being completely debt-free by 45 drove me crazy with its unexpected happiness. I also indulged in things I'd been putting off for years. I bought a new sofa, which I dreamed of even when I was still sitting on the sagging old one, took my car in for a full inspection, skimping on safety, and even booked a vacation to Hawaii. A real, long-awaited one, not the miserable long weekend at a backwater boarding house I'd always had. The family's silence was almost comical. Rita, who used to call me at least twice a month, begging for help and crying into the phone, suddenly disappeared without a word. Mom, who so skillfully made me feel guilty about the grocery bills or Dad's medications, never mentioned her presence. It seemed as if, having lost access to my wallet, they had completely forgotten about me, and it was a surprisingly light feeling, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I hoped it would always be like this, that they had finally learned to live within their means and deal with their own problems, leaving me alone. But deep down, I knew perfectly well that such people don't change. They just hide until they reach despair and decide to give up their pride. And that call came at the end of March, 3 months after that humiliating Christmas. I was sitting at work, focused on debugging code, when my mother's name appeared on the phone screen. My heart sank, and for a moment I considered hanging up, but curiosity prevailed. "Hi, Serafina." Her voice was high-pitched, cracked with fear. "Oh, thank God you answered." "What happened, Mom?" I asked, already sensing a storm. "This house, the foundation, it's completely falling apart." I leaned back in my chair, a wave of bitter recognition washing over me. This is exactly what I'd warned them about 6 months ago, when they were dreaming of a country house instead of renovating. "What exactly happened?" I asked. My mother spoke quickly, haltingly. The crack had widened, a gap had formed, everything was crumbling. Emergency inspectors had declared the house unsafe and ordered it fixed immediately, or the building would collapse. She was almost screaming, and in the background I could hear my father yelling at her, and she screaming back. "How much will the repairs cost?" I asked quietly, knowing full well what I would hear. $50,000, Serafina. We need $50,000 urgently to replace the entire foundation," she breathed, and those words revealed the true purpose of the call. I answered guardedly, "Mom, why are you calling me about this?" "Because you have savings." "We know that. You have to help us." I almost laughed. After 3 months of silence, after that morning's shame when they explained to me that Santa doesn't give presents to ungrateful children, they again considered it natural to ask me for money. "Mom, remember what you told me that time at Christmas? About ungrateful children? Don't you dare talk to me like that, Serafina Aridabeth. I am your mother. Yes, you are my mother. But at Christmas, you laughed in my face and told me I was ungrateful. You punished me for not buying you a house by making it so that I was the only one without a present. We were upset about the country house. But that's different. No, Mom. It's the same thing. You've made it clear that I'm only valuable to you when I write checks. Well, you know what? Ask Santa Claus to help you with the foundation. Maybe he'll be more generous to ungrateful parents than to ungrateful children. Serafina, please. We can't lose the house. Her voice broke, but I calmly replied, "You should have thought of that earlier when you treated me like trash." And I hung up. My hands were shaking, but inside I felt light, incredibly good. For the first time in my life, I hadn't let my mother make me pay for their mistakes again. The phone rang again. I declined. It rang again, and I declined again. That day, my mother called me over and over again, 6 times in a row, and I resolutely declined each call because I didn't want to give them any more reason to think I was an inexhaustible source of help. Then came a string of messages. "Serafina, please call me back. We need to talk. It's not just about money, it's about family. My father's chest hurts from stress. Please help." And I, knowing the price of other people's panic and not wanting to become its fuel, simply deleted all those lines without answering any of them, feeling something release inside. That evening, when I returned from work, I found a voice message from Rita on my phone and almost deleted it without listening to the end, but curiosity got the better of me. "Serafina, Mom said you hung up on me. I can't believe you. You're so cold. It's not about Christmas. Mom and Dad could lose the house. Our memories are there. You have to get over it. Family comes first. Call me back." And hearing these words from someone who for years had only reminded me of my debt when it suited her was both bitter and ironic. I poured a glass of wine, sank into the new sofa, and allowed myself to feel that 10 years of mortgage payments and endless transfers for family needs had finally stopped making me a criminal for saving my money, because they themselves had made their choice that December day and shown me where they placed their priorities. The crack in the foundation I had spoken about earlier had become a real threat, one that could have been partially prevented if they had the means or the will, but it seemed to me that now I could look on from the outside and not interfere until it was too late. My peace proved illusory. The next evening, as I was returning from work, 3 people stood at my door: Mom, Dad, and Rita, as if they were lying in wait. I felt that old familiar tightness in my chest when, seeing me in the hallway, they simultaneously exclaimed, "Serafina, we need to talk." I, wanting to leave, realized there was no way out because they had already seen me and were following me. I opened the door and let them in, knowing this conversation was inevitable, and they entered, looking around my apartment as if examining evidence that I was living better than they were, almost checking to see how I was managing my life while they suffered. "What do you want?" I asked, making no concessions, but a multitude of voices burst in at once in response. My mother, in tears, spoke of the impending collapse. My father spoke of his daughter's duty, and Rita reminded me of family loyalty and the cruelty of my no. I answered in turn, hearing in every word that old strategy: "We raised you, we fed you, you owe us." But I firmly said that they needed to fix the house, that they had a fixed pension, like many others, and that taking out a new loan or selling things was their decision, not an automatic demand on my wallet. My father, his voice growing louder, pounced on the same old arguments. "We gave you an education. We invested in you. The debt must be repaid." And I responded, reserved and cold, listing the years when my money had gone to their accounts, to medicine, to the car, reminding them that I had already paid them back so much, and that my no wasn't a whim, but a limit. Rita, with a face seeking approval, whispered about family comes first, and in every word I heard an attempt to manipulate my feelings, a hypocrisy that was beginning to irritate me considerably. They switched to more subtle tactics. Dad talked about the house being our history and the possibility of death in the night. Mom sobbed with fear, and Rita played on memories, trying to evoke shame in me. I watched them and saw how they took turns trying on old masks and inventing new ones. And in their gradually changing strategies, there was something of desperation and calculation at the same time, because I clearly understood. They were looking for any crack through which to crawl into my life and claw money out of it. I saw how they were trying to come up with a new approach, a new way to make me feel guilty and give them money. Serafina. Mom said my name with such relief in her voice, as if she'd finally shed the heavy crown of expectations. She then added without hesitation, "You're finally rich. 50,000 is nothing to you. You earn well so you can afford to support us." And in that phrase resonated all those old demands I'd known since childhood. You should. You have to. Your money is our salvation. And I suddenly felt myself becoming just a sum on a bank statement again, not a daughter with dreams and plans they stubbornly ignored. I replied sternly and calmly, "No, I won't help." And Mom gasped as if I'd committed sacrilege. "What are you doing with your money?" she whispered the next moment, and I, looking at them, calmly explained, "I'm paying more on the mortgage to pay off the apartment in 10 years. I'm saving for retirement. I've planned a vacation to Hawaii. I live my own life and I don't exist to cover other people's debts." In her eyes, it sounded like terrible insolence, followed by the familiar reproach, "How can you be selfish?" Rita demanded an answer as if I should publicly repent. "You've helped us for so many years, and you've never said thank you." I merely quietly reminded them that it wasn't a heroic act at all. They were payments I made as long as it felt right, and that expecting endless transfers was their choice, not my responsibility. Dad blushed, loudly proclaiming, "What we've done for you," and I asked when the last time anyone had inquired about my affairs, my feelings, and my plans, other than asking for money, was. Their silence was the answer, and that answer was harsher than any words. Mom, unwilling to give in, said they wouldn't leave until I agreed, but when I remained adamant, they left, looking at me as if passing judgment, and Mother said into the hallway, "This isn't the end yet." But I already knew that for me, this was the end of endless exploitation, the end of guilt cultivated by others. The days after their departure were filled with calls from relatives who, as if on cue, picked up the old score. Aunt Carol begged for mercy. Cousin Mike insisted on the importance of family. Uncle Robert even came to the office. And Aunt Margaret came to me with a Bible to read me some sermons on honoring parents. I looked at them calmly and, surprised, offered a simple answer. "Why don't you give them the money yourself?" And apparently this proposal was too unexpected because Aunt Margaret, embarrassed, left. A month later, while walking through the supermarket, I ran into Mrs. Peterson, my parents' neighbor, and learned from her that my parents had sold their car and an old boat, received part of the money, and taken out a bank loan for the rest, having solved their problem to such an extent that the foundation of the house was now secured. But they would have to pay for years. I felt relief and a slight, bitter smile, because everything they'd been seeking, for me to relieve them of the need to sacrifice, turned out to be not a goal, but merely a desire for effortless comfort. I don't feel guilty. They made their choice when they humiliated me at Christmas, showing that they valued me only as a source of money, not as a person with a right to my own life. So I stopped talking to them, and now my phone is silent. But in that silence, my savings have grown, and I have friends who aren't interested in my bank balance, but in me as a person. I have hobbies, plans, and a future that doesn't revolve around other people's financial woes.